Welcome to another brief training of coding in DataView. Today, we'll be discussing how to code subjective non-character codes. Subjective non-character codes are exactly what they sound like. We'll be coding subjectively everything except the on-screen characters. Because these are subjective codes and not objective codes, you'll likely have a slightly different interpretation than I do, and that's okay. The purpose of this video is just to give a general understanding of how these codes work. Let's start with visual intensity. We'll be coding about 20 to 30 seconds of this episode of All Hail King Julian. I'm going to go ahead and explain how the codes work. Visual intensity as well as audio intensity are coded on a 4-point scale of 0 to 3. Generally speaking, 0 is used for the absence of whatever you're coding, either the absence of visual background stimuli or the absence of auditory stimuli. The 1 to 3 codes are used to distinguish how intense the audio or visual stimuli is. We'll be beginning with visual intensity. I'll go ahead and press play and then immediately start a new cell, and then we'll be able to code this together. Before we start, it's important that we ensure that our computer is muted. Because we're coding only the visual stimuli, we don't want to be swayed or influenced by any of the auditory stimuli. We're only coding visuals here. So now I'll go ahead and press play, start a new cell, and we'll begin coding. For now, I'll code this as a 1. The background is pretty standard procedure. It's what we expect to happen. It's nothing outside of the usual of what we normally see in All Hail King Julian. But in a moment, we'll see that things are going to become much more visually intense. Right there, we're going to go ahead and code that as a 3, because things were on fire. Now we'll go ahead and move back down to a 1. I'll pause just to state, of course, when you're coding, you should be doing precise onset and offset times, but for the sake of this video, I just want to show sort of the range of what we're seeing. It's also important to take note that you're only coding things that do not include the on-screen characters. I'm not coding anything like facial expressions or the presence or absence of characters. I'm only coding the background stimuli. So in this particular example, we saw that there was sort of the general background of what we would normally expect, and then we saw a chaotic scene where things were overturned and on fire, and then we saw a return to the normal. Now let's try a valence code. Whenever we're coding a valence code, whether it be audio or visual, we're only coding in 0s and 1s. We're only coding for the absence or presence of whatever we're coding for. We're going to start with visual valence positive. Keep in mind that our computer is still muted. We're only paying attention to the visual stimuli. Additionally, we are ignoring all of the characters on screen. We are only paying attention to the background and surrounding visual stimuli. We're going to start with visual valence positive, so I'll go ahead and hit play, and then we'll jump right in. For this, the background is exactly what we would expect. And it's pretty neutral, honestly. Nothing about it is positive or negative. So we'll go ahead and just code it as a 0. And we'll keep it a 0 until things change. Nothing super positive yet. So we'll continue to just watch until we see a change. We're also keeping in mind that we're ignoring any and all characters here. We're only paying attention to the background. It's also important to note that your codes will again possibly be different from mine, and that's totally okay. You'll also find that some of these codes don't really change quite as dynamically as some of the other codes, such as the intensity codes. That will also vary by show. For sake of this training, we'll go ahead and move on to visual valence negative. Now we'll take a look at visual valence negative, And we'll go ahead and jump right in since it's very similar to visual valence positive. I'll be coding a 0 anytime I don't perceive negative content, and I'll be coding a 1 anytime I do perceive negative content. So we'll go ahead and press play. All of this is pretty neutral, so I'll go ahead and press 0. Nothing about this is particularly negative yet. However, we know in just a moment that we'll be seeing some more negative content right here. So I'll go ahead and code that as a 1. And now we're back to 0. Keep in mind, again, that we're only coding the background, and also keep in mind that the positive and negative codes are not mutually exclusive. You can code the same period of time to be both positive and negative if those codes apply. Now we'll move on and look at some of the auditory codes. Now we'll practice the auditory codes. Because we're doing the auditory codes, I've now turned up the volume on my computer. It's also important to keep in mind that because we're coding only the auditory stimuli, we'll want to minimize our window. Data view will still work just the same as if the window were on the screen. However, we don't want to be biased by any of the visual stimuli, so I'll go ahead and minimize that now. When we're coding the audio stimuli, we only want to code music, background sound effects, etc. We will not be coding any language or character voices. The only thing that we'll be coding that could be miscontrived as a character voice would be physiological sounds, such as panting from running very hard. Why don't we jump in, and I think you'll understand a bit more how we'll be coding this. So I'm going to start with audio intensity. Audio intensity, just like visual intensity, is coded on a 4-point scale of 0 to 3. 0 would indicate the absence of any background sound effects, music, etc. And then 1 to 3 are the intensity codes. I'll be doing my best to talk through why I'm making the coding decisions I am, but keep in mind that you'll be listening to both my voice and the auditory stimuli from the episode. So I'll go ahead and press play, and then we'll get started.
Just make it illegal not to like you, and I will happily enforce that.
So right here, I'll start a new box, and I'll code it as a 2 because there is some sort of jazzy music, and I think that jazzy music is about moderate intensity. I'll go ahead and press play again.
Great, they think you are.
Ooh, I can make a law like that? No. Well, I guess. Yeah,
There, I think the music subsided, so I'll code that as a 0.
One lemur will come around eventually.
Unless the one holdout
The music is
recruits more
back.
lemurs to his side. This could be the
And I'll go ahead and press 2 again, and I'll press play.
start of a revolution. Think about it. The gnashing teeth, the blind rage.
Everything just got more intense, so I'll go ahead and code that as a 3. Of course, just like any other time, you should be using exact timestamps for the onset and offset time. However, I'll just be doing rough codes just to sort of explain my thought process. Now we'll move on to audio valence, positive and negative. Now let's code some of the audio valence positive and negative codes. These will be very similar to the visual valence positive and negative codes, in that we'll only be coding 0 and 1. 1 will denote any time the audio is positive, in this case, and 0 will denote any time the audio is not positive. We'll be starting with audio valence positive, so I'll go ahead and press play, and then we'll jump right in.
Just make it illegal not to like you, and I will happily enforce that law. I can't wait to see the fear
I think
in
that this
their eyes
audio
as
is
they lie
positive,
about
so
how
I'll code it
great
as
they think
1.
you are.
Ooh, I can make a law like that? No. Well, I guess. Yeah, but.
The music went away, and there's nothing really supplementing it, so I'll code that as 0.
Come around eventually.
Unless the one holdout recruits more lemurs to
This
his
music
side,
I
this
don't
could be
think
the
is
start
quite
of a
as
revolution.
positive, so
Think
I'll
about
continue to
it.
code this as a 0.
The blind rage. We need to stamp this thing out now. How long was I out? I didn't hurt anyone, did I?
Yeah, instead of worrying about
Keep in
one
mind that we're not
citizen,
coding any
why not
voices
focus on
here.
all the stuff you do have? A great kingdom and an abundant supply of food.
Now we'll move on to audio valence negative. Finally, we'll be coding audio valence negative. This will be coded just like the video valence negative code was coded. 1 will denote the presence of negative auditory stimuli, and 0 will denote the absence of negative auditory stimuli. So I'll go ahead and press play, and we'll jump right in.
Like you, and I will happily enforce that law. I can't wait to see
You
the
know,
fear in their
this
eyes as
music,
they lie
and I'll
about
go
how
ahead and
great
pause
they
so I
did.
can explain my point. This music, even though I also coded it as a 1 for positive, I do think has sort of a mischievous and eerie note, so I'm also going to code it as a 1 for negative. These codes are not mutually exclusive, so that's totally fine to do. Okay, I'll press play and we'll jump back in.
Ooh, I can make a law like that? No. Well, I guess, yeah.
Again,
but
the music
shouldn't
subsided and there's nothing to
everybody-
really
again, by everybody, I mean
replace it.
one
So we'll
lemur will
code that as
come around
0 because there's really
Unless
nothing
the
negative
one
here.
holdout recruits more lemurs to his side. This could be the
I
start
think
of
that
a
this new
revolution.
music is pretty negative, so I'll go ahead and code that as a 1.
We need to stamp this thing out now. How long was I out? I didn't hurt
And
anyone.
again, there's nothing really here
Yeah,
except for
instead of
character
worrying about
voices,
what
so I'll code that as a
discarded
0.
Why not focus on all the stuff you do have?
We'll go ahead and stop that for now. Hopefully, this brief overview has given you a good sense of how to code the subjective non-character codes, and we'll be returning to this later with the character codes. Thank you for watching.